Miles Donovan had always been the most self-assured person in any room. As the CEO of Donovan Industries, a tech giant that had revolutionized the way people lived and worked, he had accumulated more success and wealth by the age of 35 than most people could ever dream of. His life was a seemingly endless stream of luxury, power, and social acclaim. Miles lived in sprawling mansions with modern architecture and pristine pools, drove exotic cars that roared on empty mountain roads, and surrounded himself with people who sought his favor and company. The world was his stage, and everyone in his life seemed to play their part according to the script he had written. It was one Saturday afternoon, on an outing that was supposed to be a light-hearted diversion from his usual high-end haunts, that something seemingly insignificant set into motion a series of events that would ultimately upend his carefully curated world. Miles and his closest friends, all wealthy and powerful in their own rights, decided to grab a bite at a local diner in a middle-class neighborhood. This kind of excursion was, for them, an ironic game of immersing themselves in the mundane, a brief visit to an existence that they regarded with distant curiosity. Miles and his friends sat at the far end of the diner, a corner booth that barely accommodated their collective egos. Among the group were Liam Carter, a hedge fund manager with a taste for risky investments and risky women, and a few other members of Miles's inner circle. They laughed and joked as they perused the greasy menus, their designer watches glimmering in the fluorescent lights. "You've done it all, Miles," Liam remarked with a grin, his voice carrying a note of challenge beneath the casual tone. "Built an empire, accumulated billions, and won over anyone you've ever wanted. But I doubt you can pull this next trick off." Miles raised an eyebrow, intrigued and slightly irritated by the suggestion that there was something he couldn't do. He was used to having every challenge thrown his way, crushed under the weight of his talent and resources. He leaned back in his seat, folding his arms as he gave Liam his full attention. "And what exactly are you proposing, Liam?" he asked, his voice carrying an undercurrent of authority. Liam smirked and leaned forward, his fingers drumming lightly on the table as if savoring the moment. "I bet you can't marry a woman who's completely out of our league. And I'm not talking about models or heiresses. I'm talking about someone truly ordinary." "Define ordinary," Miles replied, narrowing his eyes. Liam gestured subtly toward a nearby table where a young waitress was clearing away some dishes. She was moving with practiced efficiency, her brown hair tied back in a ponytail, and her face devoid of the makeup and polish that most women in Miles's world wore like armor. "Her," Liam said quietly. "Jenna Wallace, single mum, waitress, completely outside of our world." Miles followed Liam's gaze, his expression barely shifting as he took in Jenna's presence. He didn't even recognize her as someone who had been serving them, a reflection of how little she had registered in his mind up until that point. She seemed utterly removed from the circles of wealth and power that he navigated daily, and that realization intrigued him. "You want me to marry a waitress?" Miles asked, his tone tinged with incredulity and a hint of amusement. The rest of the table chuckled at the absurdity of the idea, but Liam's grin only widened. "That's the challenge," Liam replied confidently. "You've won every game you've played, every bet you've taken. But I'm willing to put down $2 million that you can't pull this one off. No tricks, no contracts. It has to be real." $2 million was little more than pocket change to Miles, but the dare itself held an appeal beyond the monetary reward. The idea of doing something so far removed from his usual triumphs was enticing. It wasn't just a matter of money. It was about proving to himself and to everyone else that he could achieve anything he set his mind to. He relished the idea of winning, of conquering this new challenge as he had conquered everything else in his life. Miles smiled, raising his glass of water in a mock toast. "Get the check ready, Liam," he said with unshakable confidence. "This will be easy." Jenna Wallace didn't notice the conversation at the back of the diner, nor did she pay much attention to the group of men occupying the corner booth. To her, they were just another group of customers, distinguished only by their expensive suits and slightly too loud laughter. She had worked at the diner for 3 years, doing her best to support her 5-year-old daughter, Olivia. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady, and it allowed her to keep her life on track after a series of hardships she preferred not to dwell on. As Jenna went about her tasks, wiping down tables and refilling coffee cups, she didn't anticipate that one of the wealthiest men in the city had just set his sights on her as part of a bet. Nor did she realize that her life, which had been shaped by routine and practicality, was about to be thrown into a whirlwind of unexpected change. Miles observed her quietly, his eyes lingering a moment longer than he intended. There was something in her demeanor, a mix of weariness and resilience, that intrigued him. He was accustomed to dealing with people who would bend over backward to get his attention, who measured their words and gestures with precision to curry favor or gain access to his world. But Jenna seemed different, almost indifferent to his presence. When she approached their table to clear some empty dishes, Miles seized the opportunity. "Jenna, right?" he asked, his voice smooth and confident. She glanced at him briefly, her expression neutral as she balanced a tray of plates. "Yes. Can I help you with something?" she replied, her tone polite but distant. "I don't think you've served me before," Miles said, offering her a charming smile that usually disarmed even the most reluctant conversationalists. Jenna blinked, caught off guard by the remark. "I've worked here for a while. You probably didn't notice," she said flatly, not bothering to reciprocate the smile. Miles chuckled, shaking his head slightly. "Probably not. But that changes today," he replied, his voice dripping with a confidence that he didn't doubt for a second. "How about we grab a coffee sometime?" Jenna raised an eyebrow, her skepticism evident. "Sorry, I'm working," she said curtly, turning to walk away. But Miles wasn't one to be easily dismissed. "Not now, of course," he called after her, keeping his smile firmly in place. "But you must get a day off, right? We could chat a little." Jenna turned back to him, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if she was trying to gauge his intentions. "I need to get back to work," she said, her voice firm. And with that, she left the table, her footsteps echoing softly in the otherwise noisy diner. Miles felt a brief flicker of frustration, something he wasn't accustomed to experiencing in his interactions with women. He was used to winning people over with little effort, to having them fall into step with his plans. But Jenna's resistance, her apparent disinterest, only served to intrigue him further. As Jenna moved to clear another table, Miles watched her, his mind racing with thoughts of the challenge ahead. Winning Jenna over would be different from any of his past conquests, and he found that prospect oddly exhilarating. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of anticipation, of excitement at the thought of pursuing something that wasn't guaranteed. He leaned back in his seat, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "You're persistent, Jenna," he muttered under his breath, his tone more determined than before. "You'll find that out soon enough." Unbeknownst to Jenna, the wheels had already been set in motion. For Miles, this was no longer just a bet. It was a challenge, a game that he was determined to win, and he didn't intend to lose. A few days later, Miles returned to the diner, this time arriving alone and at a different hour. He took a seat near the counter, choosing a spot where he could watch Jenna as she worked. She moved with the same focused efficiency, her attention divided between serving customers and handling the demands of the kitchen staff. When she approached his table to take his order, Miles didn't wait for her to ask. "Hey, Jenna," he said, smiling as if he was genuinely happy to see her. "I thought maybe you were expecting to see me again." She raised her eyebrows, clearly caught off guard. "I didn't know you came here so often," she replied, her voice betraying a hint of sarcasm. "Well, I think I'll start coming more often," Miles said playfully. "Great service and all." Jenna shot him a skeptical look, but jotted down his order without further comment. As she started to turn away, Miles decided to press his luck once more. "So, how about that coffee?" he asked, his tone casual but insistent. Jenna studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. She took a deep breath, as if weighing her options, before responding. "Look, I appreciate it, but I'm really busy. My life doesn't leave room for casual meetups." Miles realized that if he kept approaching Jenna with the same casual demeanor, she would continue to brush him off. He needed a different tactic, something that would convey that he was genuinely interested in her, not just in winning her over. "I understand," he said, lowering his voice to sound more sincere. "I'm not here to make your life harder. I just want to get to know you better." Jenna looked at him with a mix of annoyance and curiosity. Her brow furrowed slightly as she considered his words. She seemed ready to turn him down again, but something about his expression made her hesitate. After a moment, she let out a small sigh and agreed. "All right, but it'll be a quick coffee. I don't have time for much more than that." It wasn't the enthusiastic response he was used to, but it was a start. Miles watched her walk away, feeling a new sense of purpose. Jenna wasn't like the other women he had met. She was real, grounded, and not easily swayed by charm alone. And for the first time in a long time, Miles found himself genuinely intrigued by the idea of getting to know someone beyond their surface. Jenna had unknowingly become the key to his latest challenge, a challenge that went far beyond money or pride. And as far as Miles was concerned, he never backed down from a challenge. Over the next few weeks, the interactions between Miles and Jenna became more frequent. Despite the walls she tried to maintain, Jenna found herself increasingly aware of Miles's presence. He was relentless, always showing up at the diner with an easy smile and a casual demeanor that seemed almost too perfect to be genuine. Jenna couldn't help but wonder what his true intentions were, but every time she tried to ignore him, Miles found a way to draw her into a conversation. Jenna had agreed to that first coffee meeting out of curiosity more than anything else. She didn't understand why a man like Miles, clearly from a world of privilege and wealth, would have any interest in someone like her. But something about his persistence intrigued her, and when he had spoken with such earnestness, she felt compelled to give him a chance, if only for a brief moment. They met at a small, quiet cafe not far from the diner. Jenna arrived on time, still wearing her uniform from work, and she felt uncomfortable as she walked in. The other patrons were clearly not coming from long shifts at a diner, and she wondered for the 1,000th time why she had agreed to this meeting. Miles was already there, seated at a table in the back. He was dressed casually, yet there was an effortless elegance in the way he held himself. As Jenna approached, he stood up slightly, smiling in a way that was both disarming and confident. "Hey, Jenna," he greeted her warmly. "Thanks for agreeing to this." "Sure," she replied, taking a seat and fidgeting with the strap of her bag. She felt out of place, uncertain of what to expect from this strange meeting. "So, what did you want to talk about?" Miles chuckled softly, as if sensing her discomfort. "Nothing in particular," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I just thought it would be nice to get to know you better." Jenna raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "And why would someone like you want to get to know someone like me?" she asked, her tone bordering on accusatory. She didn't mean to sound defensive, but the question had been burning in her mind since the day he first approached her. Miles's smile faded slightly, and he seemed to consider her question for a moment before responding. "Maybe that's exactly why," he said quietly. "You're not part of my world, and I find that interesting." Jenna didn't know how to respond to that, so she simply nodded and turned her attention to the menu, though she had no intention of ordering anything. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions, but Miles seemed content to let it linger. After a few moments, he broke the silence. "How long have you worked at the diner?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "A few years," Jenna replied, her tone guarded. She didn't like talking about herself, especially not to someone like Miles, who probably couldn't relate to her life in any way. "It's a job that pays the bills." "I get that," Miles said, and Jenna wondered if he really did. He must have noticed her skepticism, because he quickly added, "I know I come from a different background, but I didn't always have it easy. My parents pushed me to succeed, and there were times when it felt like the pressure would never end." Jenna studied him for a moment, trying to gauge his sincerity. "Must be tough," she said, her voice flat. Miles smiled slightly, recognizing the sarcasm in her words, but choosing not to acknowledge it. "It was, in its own way," he replied, "but I'm not trying to compare my life to yours. I don't know, Jenna. There's something about you that I find refreshing." She frowned, still unsure of what to make of his words. "You don't know me," she pointed out. "Not yet," he agreed, "but I'd like to." Jenna sighed, feeling torn between her desire to maintain her distance and the strange pull she felt toward him. She had spent so long building up walls around herself and Olivia, and she wasn't sure she wanted to let anyone in, especially not a man like Miles Donovan. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke. "All right, but I'm not looking for anything serious," she said firmly. "I have a daughter to think about, and she's my priority." "I understand," Miles said, and he sounded like he meant it. "I'm not here to make your life harder, Jenna. I just want to get to know you better." Jenna wasn't sure if she believed him, but for some reason she felt compelled to give him a chance. She didn't know if it was his persistence or something else. But there was a part of her that wanted to see where this strange connection might lead. When their coffee meeting ended, Jenna left the cafe feeling more confused than ever. Miles had been charming and attentive, and there had been moments when she almost forgot that he was a wealthy CEO with a life completely different from her own. But as she walked back to her small apartment, the doubts crept back in. What could he possibly want with her? And why couldn't she just walk away? As for Miles, he returned to his penthouse feeling a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. Jenna was unlike anyone he had ever met, and her straightforwardness was both disarming and refreshing. He found himself wanting to spend more time with her, not just to win the bet, but because he was genuinely curious about her and her life. It was a feeling he wasn't used to, and it left him feeling slightly off balance. Miles continued to show up at the diner, always finding an excuse to strike up a conversation with Jenna. Little by little, she began to let her guard down, though she was still cautious about getting too close. Olivia, on the other hand, took an immediate liking to Miles. She was a bright, curious child, and Miles made an effort to engage with her whenever he had the chance. Jenna watched their interactions with a mixture of amusement and apprehension, unsure of how to feel about the growing bond between her daughter and this wealthy stranger. The more time Miles spent with Jenna and Olivia, the more he began to question his own motives. What had started as a simple bet with Liam was beginning to feel like something much more complicated. He found himself looking forward to his visits to the diner, not just because of the challenge, but because he genuinely enjoyed Jenna's company. She was strong and resilient, qualities that he admired but rarely encountered in his world of privilege and excess. But as their connection deepened, Miles knew he needed to take the next step. The bet wasn't just about winning Jenna over, it was about convincing her to marry him. And while the idea had seemed absurd at first, Miles now found himself wanting it more than anything. One afternoon, as Jenna was finishing her shift at the diner, Miles approached her with a determined expression. "Jenna, I've been thinking a lot about us," he began, his voice unusually serious. "I know this might sound sudden, but I want to take this seriously." Jenna looked at him, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Take what seriously?" she asked, her voice cautious. Miles took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to say. "Marriage," he said simply. Jenna's eyes widened in shock, and she laughed involuntarily, the sound almost bitter. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I barely know you, Miles." "I know it sounds crazy," he admitted, trying to keep his composure. "But I feel like we have something special, something real, and I want to give you and Olivia a better life." Jenna shook her head, still in disbelief. "What kind of reality is this?" she muttered, more to herself than to him. Miles could sense that he was losing her, and he knew he needed to be more convincing. "I know I come from a different world," he said softly. "And I know this sounds absurd, but I see something in you, Jenna, something real. And I want to build a life with you and Olivia." Jenna took a deep breath, torn between the instinct to reject him and the strange attraction she felt toward him. She couldn't deny that the idea of giving Olivia a better future was tempting, but she also couldn't ignore the voice in her head telling her that this was too good to be true. "I'm not asking for an answer right now," Miles said quickly, sensing her hesitation. "Just think about it. I don't want to pressure you, but I believe we could make this work." Jenna studied him, trying to understand the intentions behind his words. Part of her wanted to believe him, but another part of her was still wary. After a long moment of silence, she finally spoke. "I'll think about it," she said quietly, before turning and walking away. In the days that followed, Jenna's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She couldn't stop thinking about Miles's proposal and what it could mean for her and Olivia. On one hand, the idea of marrying a man like Miles seemed like a fairy tale, a chance to provide a stable future for her daughter. But on the other hand, it felt like a betrayal of everything she had fought for, a decision that would uproot the life she had carefully built for herself and Olivia. As for Miles, he was plagued by his own doubts. He knew the bet was superficial, but his growing feelings for Jenna made it feel like something much more significant. He couldn't deny the attraction he felt toward her, or the admiration he had developed for her resilience and strength. But he also knew that his past decisions, the choices he had made in pursuit of success and/or wealth, could come back to haunt him. It wasn't long before those choices caught up with him. One day, while reviewing old business documents in his home office, Miles stumbled across a file related to a factory his company had shut down years ago. At the time, it had seemed like a routine business decision, a necessary cost-cutting measure to increase profits. But as he read through the file, memories of the factory closure resurfaced, and he began to piece together a connection he had never considered before. The factory had been located in a small town, and hundreds of employees had lost their jobs when it was shut down. For Miles, it had been just another business move, a way to streamline operations and boost the company's bottom line. But as he read through the report, he realized with a sinking feeling that the factory had been in Jenna's hometown. It didn't take long for him to confirm his suspicions. The factory closure had directly affected Jenna's life, forcing her into financial hardship and leading her to work at the diner to support Olivia. Unbeknownst to him at the time, his decision had caused the very struggles that Jenna had faced. The discovery left Miles reeling with guilt and regret. He couldn't believe that his past actions had caused Jenna so much pain, and he knew that he had to tell her the truth. But the thought of admitting what he had done filled him with dread. How could he expect her to forgive him for something so devastating? For days, Miles tried to hide his turmoil, but Jenna could sense that something was wrong. She noticed that he seemed distant and preoccupied, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he was keeping something from her. Her doubts and fears only grew stronger, and she began to question whether she had made a mistake by letting him into her life. Finally, Miles couldn't keep the secret any longer. One evening, as they sat in the living room after Olivia had gone to bed, he decided it was time to tell her everything. "Jenna," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "I need to talk to you about something important, something from my past." Jenna looked at him, her expression wary. "What is it, Miles?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. Miles took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "Do you remember the factory you used to work at before we met?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jenna's face clouded with sadness at the memory of that difficult time. "Yes, I remember," she said quietly. "It was a really hard time for me. I was pregnant with Olivia, and I had to face it all alone." Miles looked away, feeling the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. "Jenna, it was me," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I was the one who ordered the factory to close." Jenna stared at him in shock, her eyes widening as she tried to process what he had just said. "You did that?" she whispered, her voice almost breaking. "Yes," he replied, his voice low and filled with shame. "At the time, it was just a business decision. I was focused on profits, and I didn't think about the people it would affect. Jenna, I'm so sorry." Jenna slowly pulled away from him, her mind reeling with the realization of what he had done. Every struggle, every sacrifice she had made to support Olivia and keep her life together, it all led back to him. The betrayal felt almost unbearable, and she didn't know if she could ever forgive him. But you, she whispered, her voice shaking with anger and pain. You destroyed my life, and now you want me to just forget it. Jenna, please, Miles pleaded, his voice filled with desperation. If I had known, I would never have made that choice. I'm so sorry. But Jenna couldn't listen to his excuses. She stood up, her hands trembling as she tried to hold back the tears. I can't do this, she said, her voice breaking. I can't be with someone who caused me so much pain. She turned and walked away, leaving Miles alone in the living room, consumed by guilt and regret. He knew that he had made a terrible mistake, and he wasn't sure if he could ever make things right. In the days that followed, the tension between them grew unbearable. Jenna could barely look at him, and their once warm and easy conversations were replaced by silence and cold stares. Miles tried to reach out to her, but every attempt was met with rejection. He felt lost and helpless, unsure of how to fix the damage he had caused. For Jenna, the pain of the past was still raw, and the discovery of Miles's role in her struggles only deepened the wounds. She couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal, and she didn't know if she could ever trust him again. Life in the mansion carried on, but it felt empty and hollow. Miles's wealth and power, once sources of pride, now seemed meaningless in the face of the damage he had done. He knew that words wouldn't be enough to heal the rift between them, and he resolved to find a way to make things right. Not just for Jenna, but for everyone affected by his past decisions. He began searching for the former employees of the factory, traveling to the town where it had been located and meeting with the people who had been affected. He listened to their stories, their hardships, and their anger, and he felt the weight of his guilt deepen with every conversation. It was a painful and humbling experience, but Miles knew it was necessary if he was ever going to prove to Jenna that he was truly sorry. After days of meetings and difficult conversations, Miles decided to establish a support fund for the factory's former employees. He set aside a significant portion of his fortune to help the families who had been affected. And he made a public statement acknowledging his mistakes and expressing his regret. When Miles returned home, Jenna was still avoiding him, but he was determined to talk to her. One evening, as Jenna finished putting Olivia to bed, Miles waited for her in the living room. When she entered, he called out to her, his voice calm but steady. Jenna, I know you're hurt, and I understand if you can't forgive me, he said quietly. But I need to tell you what I've been doing. I've been trying to make things right. Jenna folded her arms, her expression skeptical. And how exactly do you plan to fix the past, Miles? She asked, her voice laced with bitterness. With money? That won't change what you did. I know it won't, he replied, his voice steady. But I went to the town. I spoke with the former employees, listened to what they went through, and I'm creating a fund to help them rebuild their lives. I know this doesn't erase what I did, but it's my way of trying to make up for the pain I caused. Jenna watched him in silence, surprised by the sincerity in his words. She didn't want to believe him, but she couldn't ignore the effort he had made to make amends. That night, as Jenna lay awake in bed, her mind was filled with conflicting emotions. She couldn't bring herself to forgive him yet, but she also couldn't deny that he seemed to be genuinely trying to change. The months they had spent together had revealed a side of Miles that seemed far removed from the man who had ordered the factory closure, and she didn't know what to make of it. Miles, on the other hand, knew that words would never be enough to repair the damage he had caused. He was prepared to do whatever it took to earn Jenna's forgiveness, even if it meant giving up everything he had worked so hard to build. He knew that he couldn't change the past, but he was determined to prove that he had truly changed. In the days following his heartfelt confession and his attempts to make amends, the atmosphere in the mansion remained heavy with unspoken words and unresolved pain. Jenna went about her daily routine with a strained silence, while Miles, weighed down by guilt and uncertainty, struggled to navigate the growing distance between them. He had always been confident in his ability to control the outcomes in his life, but with Jenna, he felt lost. Jenna, for her part, could barely look at Miles without feeling the sting of betrayal. She had thought that perhaps he was different, that he was someone she could trust. But now, every time she saw him, she was reminded of the factory closure that had upended her life, and of the fact that the man she had started to open her heart to was the very cause of her suffering. The revelation of Miles's role in her past made every kind word, every gesture of affection, feel like a cruel irony. She had worked so hard to protect herself and Olivia, to build a life despite everything, and now it felt like it was all crumbling around her. One evening, during a dinner that felt more like a ritual than a shared meal, Miles gathered the courage to break the suffocating silence. Olivia was already in bed, leaving the two of them alone at the long dining table. The food sat untouched on their plates, and the silence was thick and uncomfortable. "Jenna," Miles began, his voice breaking through the quiet with a hesitant tremor, "I know I hurt you, and I know you have every right to be angry with me. But please, would you give me a chance to show that I've changed?" Jenna set her fork down and folded her hands, staring at the polished wood of the table as if it held the answers she sought. Finally, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and exhaustion. "You want a chance, Miles?" she repeated, her voice barely concealing the bitterness. "You took everything from me, and now you want a chance to prove you're a good person. Don't you think that's a little too convenient?" Miles took a deep breath, fighting the urge to beg. He had to keep his emotions in check, had to find a way to express his regret without overwhelming her. "I know it's not enough, Jenna," he said quietly. "But since I met you, I've changed. You and Olivia, you've made me see things differently. I want to be better for both of you, and I'll do whatever it takes to earn your forgiveness." Jenna shook her head, her expression one of exasperation and weariness. "It's too late for that, Miles," she replied, her voice laced with resignation. "I let you into my life and into Olivia's life because I believed you were different. But in the end, you're just like everyone else I've ever known." She stood up, leaving him alone at the table, his words hanging in the air like ghosts of unfulfilled promises. As she walked away, Miles felt the crushing weight of his failures pressing down on him. He knew that words wouldn't change anything. He needed to do something more, something meaningful, to prove that he was truly committed to making things right. In the following days, Miles became even more resolute in his determination to show Jenna that he had changed. He spent hours researching the town where the factory had been, trying to find the people who had been affected by its closure. He reached out to community leaders, former employees, and local organizations, and he began to piece together a plan to help those who had suffered because of his decisions. It wasn't an easy process. Many of the people he contacted were angry, bitter, and rightfully so. They saw him as the man who had destroyed their livelihoods, and they had little interest in hearing his apologies. But Miles persisted, listening to their stories and acknowledging the pain he had caused. He knew that he couldn't undo the past, but he hoped that by offering tangible support, he could at least start to make amends. Eventually, he established a support fund for the former employees of the factory, using a significant portion of his personal fortune to help them rebuild their lives. He made a public statement, taking full responsibility for his actions and expressing his deep regret for the harm he had caused. It was a humbling experience, and it left him feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way he had never felt before. When the fund was finally established, Miles returned to the mansion, exhausted but hopeful. He knew that Jenna still hadn't forgiven him, but he hoped that this gesture would at least show her that he was serious about making things right. He didn't expect her to embrace him with open arms, but he needed her to see that he was trying, that he wasn't the man she had thought he was. One evening, as Jenna finished putting Olivia to bed, Miles waited for her in the living room. When she entered, he stood up, his expression cautious but determined. "Jenna," he began, his voice steady despite the nervousness he felt. "I know you're hurt, and I don't blame you for that. But I need to tell you what I've been doing." She folded her arms, her posture defensive, but she didn't walk away. "What is it, Miles?" she asked, her voice wary. "I've been trying to make things right," he said, meeting her gaze with a sincerity that surprised even him. "I went to the town where the factory was, and I spoke with the former employees. I listened to their stories, and I've established a support fund to help them rebuild their lives." Jenna watched him in silence, her expression unreadable. "And what does that change?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Do you think throwing money at the problem will fix everything?" "No," Miles replied, shaking his head. "I know it won't. But it's a start. I want to show you that I'm serious about changing and that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." Jenna took a deep breath, her eyes filled with conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to believe him, to see the sincerity in his words and give him a chance. But another part of her was still wary, still uncertain if she could trust him. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Miles," she admitted, her words heavy with the weight of her pain. "But maybe we can see what happens." Her cautious response gave Miles a glimmer of hope, and he nodded, his relief palpable. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, and that earning Jenna's forgiveness wouldn't be easy. But he was prepared to face any challenge, to prove that he was worthy of her trust and her love. Miles began to change his life in ways that went beyond the public gestures of remorse. He distanced himself from the friends who had encouraged the bet, realizing that their values and priorities no longer aligned with his own. Liam, in particular, couldn't understand why Miles was taking the whole situation so seriously. One night, during a dinner that was meant to be a casual catch-up, Liam confronted him directly. "Miles, what's going on with you?" Liam asked, his tone laced with confusion and frustration. "You're pulling away from everyone and you're acting completely different. Is this all because of the bet?" Miles took a deep breath, feeling a surge of irritation rise within him. "It was never just a joke to me, Liam," he said quietly, his voice laced with conviction. "I want things to work with Jenna, and if you can't understand that, maybe you should focus on your own life." Liam stared at him, a look of disbelief crossing his face. "So, it's serious then?" he asked, his voice tinged with incredulity. "Yes," Miles replied, his voice firm. "It's serious, and if you can't accept that, then maybe we shouldn't be friends." The conversation marked the end of his friendship with Liam, and with it, the final link to the superficial life he had once led. Miles knew that he could no longer maintain the same relationships or values, and he was willing to leave behind the world he had always known in order to build something real with Jenna and Olivia. When he returned home that evening, Jenna noticed that he seemed troubled. They sat together in the living room, and for the first time in weeks, Miles opened up to her about how lost he felt. "I feel like I'm drifting away from everything," he admitted, his voice filled with a quiet desperation. "Like everything I used to value is slipping away." Jenna placed her hand over his, her touch hesitant but sincere. "Maybe you're just finding something more real, Miles," she said softly. "Sometimes we need to get lost to find ourselves." Her words struck a chord deep within him, and for the first time, Miles felt a sense of peace amidst the turmoil. He realized that the life he had built for himself, the wealth, the power, the status, had never truly fulfilled him. It was the relationships he had with Jenna and Olivia that brought him a sense of purpose and meaning, and he was willing to fight for them, no matter what it took. In the weeks that followed, Miles kept his distance, respecting Jenna's need for space. He continued to reach out to her occasionally, sending messages that were careful and respectful, never pressuring her for more than she was willing to give. He knew that earning her forgiveness would be a slow process, and he was prepared to be patient. During this time, Miles also began to rebuild his life in ways that reflected the values Jenna had taught him: simplicity, empathy, and honesty. He spent more time at home, focused on small, meaningful activities that brought him closer to the people who mattered most. He continued to support the former factory workers and became involved in community projects that helped struggling families, finding a sense of purpose in helping others. Finally, after weeks of reflection, Jenna reached out to him. She agreed to meet for one last conversation, and as they sat together, she spoke with a calmness that belied the storm of emotions she felt inside. "I won't pretend that what you did didn't hurt me," she said quietly, her eyes steady as she looked at him. "I know you're trying, and I can see that you've changed. But for me, rebuilding that trust will be a long and difficult process." Miles nodded, his voice steady despite the emotion he felt. "I understand, Jenna," he replied. "I'm willing to wait as long as it takes because for the first time I feel like I've found something real. And I won't give up on it." Jenna's eyes filled with tears, but she held them back, her expression resolute. She had decided to give Miles a chance, not because she had fully forgiven him, but because she could see that he was genuinely trying to change. She knew that there would still be challenges ahead, but she was willing to face them, trusting that the man standing before her was sincere and determined to prove his worth. In the following months, their relationship continued to evolve, cautiously but steadily. Miles respected Jenna's boundaries and made sure not to promise more than he could deliver. He showed his commitment through his actions, dedicating himself to the support fund and becoming actively involved in Olivia's life. He attended her school events, helped her with her homework, and spent time with her in ways that felt natural and genuine. For Jenna, the gradual process of rebuilding trust was both challenging and rewarding. She still remembered the betrayal, but she also saw the consistent efforts Miles was making to change. He was becoming the present father figure that Olivia had never had, and the man Jenna had always wanted but never thought she would find. One evening, while they were together at her house, Jenna decided it was time to address the lingering doubts she still carried. "Miles," she began hesitantly, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of the table. "I want you to know that it still hurts. What you did with the factory. The bet. It's not something easy to forget. Miles looked at her in silence, waiting, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. But Jenna continued, taking a deep breath. I believe you're changing, and despite everything, I'm willing to try to move forward. I just need you to be sincere with me. Always. I can't handle another disappointment. I can't let Olivia go through that again. Miles reached across the table, taking her hand in his. I promise, Jenna, he said, his voice filled with emotion. Nothing will be like it was before. I'm here for both of you, and that will never change. Jenna smiled, a small but genuine smile that spoke of the hope she still held onto. It wasn't total forgiveness, but it was a start, a real possibility for rebuilding what they had lost. As the months went by, the new beginning between Miles and Jenna was built carefully, with every conversation and every act of kindness reinforcing the trust they were trying to rebuild. It wasn't always easy, and there were still moments of doubt and hesitation. But slowly, they began to find their way back to each other, creating a foundation that was stronger and more genuine than before. Olivia, for her part, already saw Miles as a part of her life, and she barely hid how much she liked him. She would often run to him with her drawings, proudly showing off her latest creations, and Miles would listen attentively, encouraging her creativity and praising her efforts. Through his actions, Miles showed Jenna and Olivia that he was committed to being there for them, not just in words, but in deeds. And as the trust between him and Jenna grew stronger, they began to dream of a future that was no longer defined by the past, but by the love and commitment they had for each other. The transformation of Miles and Jenna's relationship was not defined by grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but by the small, consistent steps they took towards each other. It was a quiet process of healing that neither of them rushed. Miles made it a point to respect Jenna's boundaries, never pushing for more than she was ready to offer, while Jenna gradually allowed herself to let go of her lingering doubts, bit by bit, as she saw the sincerity in his actions. It was during the cold December that Miles began to notice a subtle shift in their interactions. The air was crisp and the days were shorter, but their conversations grew longer and more open. Jenna, who once kept her emotions closely guarded, started sharing more about her past, her struggles as a young single mother, the loneliness she had felt, and the sacrifices she made for Olivia. She talked about her dreams, the ones she had pushed aside when life became a series of survival and responsibilities. Miles listened with a quiet attentiveness that surprised even Jenna. There was a vulnerability in his demeanor, a willingness to confront his own flaws that made her feel comfortable enough to be honest. It wasn't just his willingness to change that touched her, but his genuine desire to be someone different, someone better, for her and for Olivia. One cold December evening, Miles invited Jenna and Olivia over for a simple Christmas dinner at his newly renovated home. After selling his company and divesting most of his lavish lifestyle, Miles had moved into a smaller but cozier house. It was still elegant, but it had a warmth that the mansion never did. It was decorated modestly with soft lights and a simple tree, creating an intimate atmosphere that was miles apart from the grandeur of his old world. Jenna arrived with Olivia, and as they stepped inside, Olivia's eyes lit up at the sight of the tree. Miles welcomed them with a smile that was genuine and unguarded, and Jenna couldn't help but notice how at ease he seemed in this new life. It was a side of him that she hadn't seen before, and it gave her a sense of reassurance. As they sat down to dinner, Olivia chatted excitedly about the decorations and the presents she hoped to receive, her childlike enthusiasm filling the room with joy. Jenna watched Olivia with a gentle smile, her heart warmed by the sight of her daughter's happiness. For so long, Jenna had worried about giving Olivia the childhood she deserved, but in moments like these, she felt a sense of relief. Miles, too, felt a quiet happiness as he watched them. The holiday had once been just another social event for him, a time for lavish parties and expensive gifts. But now, it was something different. It was an opportunity to share simple moments with the people who mattered most to him. As he passed a dish to Jenna, their fingers brushed briefly, and he felt a surge of gratitude for this second chance. After dinner, they gathered in the living room, and Olivia eagerly opened the presents under the tree. Her eyes widened in delight as she unwrapped a doll she had been hoping for, and she ran to Miles, wrapping her small arms around him in a tight hug. "Thank you, Miles," she exclaimed, her voice filled with pure joy. Miles smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment as he hugged her back. "You're very welcome, Olivia," he replied, his voice gentle. Jenna watched the scene with a lump in her throat, feeling a rush of emotions she hadn't expected. It wasn't just Olivia's happiness that touched her. It was the realization that Miles had become a genuine part of their lives. After Olivia had gone to bed, exhausted from the excitement of the evening, Miles and Jenna sat together on the couch, the glow of the Christmas lights casting soft shadows on the walls. The silence between them was comfortable, and for the first time in a long time, Jenna felt a sense of peace. "These past few months have been good," Jenna said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think we've built something real, something I never thought could exist." Miles looked at her, his eyes reflecting the warmth of the moment. "I've never been this happy, Jenna," he replied softly. "Everything I thought I needed, all the wealth, the status, it doesn't matter anymore. You and Olivia. You've given me something I didn't even know I was missing." Jenna sighed, feeling the weight of his words. There was a sincerity in his voice that she couldn't deny, and it resonated with the part of her that still wanted to believe in him. She had seen the changes in him, not just in his actions, but in the way he carried himself, the way he approached life with a newfound humility and purpose. "You've shown me that change is possible," she said, her voice wavering slightly with emotion. "And I believe that today, you're the man who deserves to be by our side." They spent the rest of the evening talking about the future, sharing dreams and plans that were simple yet meaningful. Miles talked about a community project he wanted to start, a program to help struggling families in the city. He had been inspired by what he had learned from Jenna and Olivia, and he wanted to give back in a way that felt purposeful. As the new year approached, Miles decided to take an important and unexpected step. He had been planning it for some time, but he wanted to wait until he was sure that Jenna could trust him completely. On a quiet evening, he took Jenna and Olivia to the same small cafe where they had first met. It was a place that held memories of uncertainty and doubt, but now it was a symbol of how far they had come. As they sat together, enjoying a simple meal, Miles turned to Jenna, his expression unusually serious. "There's something I want to ask you," he said, his voice steady despite the nervousness he felt. Jenna looked at him, her brow furrowing slightly in curiosity. "What is it, Miles?" she asked. Miles reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, his fingers trembling slightly as he opened it to reveal an elegant but understated ring. He knew that anything too flashy would intimidate her. So he had chosen something that reflected sincerity rather than extravagance. "Jenna," he began, his voice filled with emotion, "I know our journey hasn't been easy, and I know I've made mistakes. But I love you, and I love Olivia. You've shown me what it means to have a real family, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I can be the partner and father you both deserve. Will you marry me?" For a moment, Jenna was speechless. The proposal felt surreal, but the sincerity in Miles's eyes was undeniable. She had spent so long guarding her heart, but now she could see that the man in front of her was truly different from the one she had first met. With tears in her eyes, she nodded, a small smile breaking through her disbelief. "Yes, Miles," she whispered. "I'll marry you." Miles slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands shaking with relief and happiness. He pulled her into a tight embrace, feeling a sense of fulfillment he had never experienced before. It wasn't about winning a bet or proving a point. It was about finding a family, a purpose, and a love that was real. They held a small ceremony surrounded by close friends and family, exchanging vows that were filled with promises of love and commitment. Miles stood before Jenna, his voice steady and filled with emotion as he vowed to be the partner and father that she and Olivia deserved. Jenna, too, made her vows, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke of forgiveness, trust, and new beginnings. As they exchanged rings, Miles knew that this time his commitment wasn't driven by pride or competition, but by the genuine love he felt. And as he looked into Jenna's eyes, he saw the same love reflected back at him. Life after the wedding was marked by small moments of genuine happiness. Miles continued his work on the community project, dedicating his time to helping families who were struggling to make ends meet. Jenna, inspired by her own experiences, began volunteering at a local women's shelter, offering support and guidance to single mothers who were facing hardships similar to those she had once endured. Olivia, now surrounded by love and stability, thrived in the new family dynamic. She was no longer the shy and uncertain child she had once been, but a bright and confident young girl who knew she had a family that supported her in everything. Miles became a solid father figure in her life, someone she could rely on and trust completely. 1 year after their wedding, Jenna and Miles received news that deeply moved them. They were expecting a baby. The arrival of this new member brought even more joy to the couple, and for Miles, it was the realization of a dream he hadn't even imagined he had. He had spent so long chasing after success and wealth, but now he realized that the greatest achievement of his life was the family he had built with Jenna and Olivia. When the baby was born, Miles held the tiny child in his arms for the first time, tears streaming down his face as he felt an overwhelming surge of love and gratitude. Jenna watched him, her own eyes filled with tears, and she knew that their family was finally complete. In the months that followed, life settled into a rhythm that was both ordinary and extraordinary. They spent their days enjoying the simple joys of family life, playing with Olivia in the park, cooking meals together, and sharing quiet moments of laughter and conversation. It was a life that was free from the pressures of wealth and status, and for the first time, they felt truly content. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching Olivia play with her new baby sibling, Miles turned to Jenna, his expression filled with a quiet gratitude. "Thank you for believing in me," he said softly, "for giving me the chance to be a better person." Jenna smiled, squeezing his hand as she looked at him with a warmth that came from a place of deep understanding. "Thank you for proving that I was right to believe in you," she replied. As they watched their children play together, Jenna and Miles knew that their journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. They had faced their fears, confronted their pasts, and built a life that was defined not by wealth or success, but by love and trust. In the end, the bet that had brought them together was a distant memory, a catalyst for a transformation that neither of them could have anticipated. And as they walked together, now as a united and complete family, they knew that the real victory wasn't in winning a challenge, but in finding a love that was true and a life that was meaningful. For Jenna, the journey had been one of healing and forgiveness, a path that led her to the family she had always dreamed of. And for Miles, it had been a journey of redemption and self-discovery, a realization that the greatest wealth in life came not from money or power, but from the connections he had made and the love he had earned. Together, they faced the future with hope, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would always have each other.